I am super excited that we have rolled out the big guns on this issue. You are looking at the entirety of the South Asia program of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am Kori Schake, the Deputy Director-General of this fine ball club, and I elbow my way onto our program from time to time so that I can have the opportunity to learn from the people I work for. And three of the very best are with us this morning. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, the head of our South Asia program, Antoine Levesques, and Viraj Solanki. And I will introduce them at a little bit greater length as each of them goes to speak. And they have, in one more demonstration of what a squared away team they are, they have actually deconflicted what they are going to say so that they each have a separate lane and we can cover as much ground as possible while still leaving time for you to have a conversation with them. So let's get started right away. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury is a senior fellow here at the IISS. He's an expert on the Indian neighborhoods, foreign and security policies, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and regional security, counter-extremism and terrorism, regional nuclear issues, the Indian Navy, and naval issues of the Indian Ocean. In addition to his own excellent research, he also runs a very vibrant Track 1.5 policy conversation among countries in the region. He was educated at a little university not far from here. He is a lecturer at Oxford. He was in the NSC Secretariat of the Indian Prime Minister, and he is going to talk to us today about the broad trends, the new decision makers, relationships with Pakistan and Afghanistan, and post-Brexit UK relations with India. Rahul, teach us.
Thank you. Let me begin by talking first about some of the general trends that I think we will see in the next few years. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's return to power in a landslide victory in general elections a month ago indicates a large degree of continuity with some change in India's foreign and security policies. The objective of India's foreign policy will continue to be to seek a stable international environment to ensure an ambitious domestic economic and political transformation. This will take place through the expansion of India's international engagements bilaterally, trilaterally, as well as multilaterally. At the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last year, Modi strongly articulated for the first time the centrality of the Indo-Pacific region to India's foreign policy. This will continue. The key to all this will be India's growing economic power. By the end of the year, India will overtake both the UK and France to become the fifth largest economy in the world. And the Indian government expects the economy to grow from nearly $3 trillion currently to $5 trillion within the next 5 years. At the same time, the objective of India's security policy will continue to be to seek a safe and secure environment within India's borders. This will continue through its neighborhood first approach, emphasized by the participation of select regional leaders in Modi's swearing-in ceremony in Delhi on the 30th of May, as well as Modi's first official visits to the Maldives and Sri Lanka. The key to India's security policy objective, I believe, will be the exercise of military dominance and economic and infrastructural connectivity in the neighborhood amidst an expansion of India's roles and responsibilities in the Indian Ocean. In effect, Modi's expanded electoral mandate today suggests greater political confidence in New Delhi, a forceful projection of India's great power ambitions on the world stage, and the assertion of influence in an expanded neighborhood. But in a significant change in the Modi II government, all the members of the highest decision-making body on foreign policy and security, the Cabinet Committee on Security, are new to their jobs, with the exception of Modi. The new Home Minister, Amit Shah, Modi's long-standing confidant from his days as Gujarat Chief Minister, is widely considered to be the number 2 in the cabinet. Dr. S. Jaishankar, a recently retired professional diplomat and strategic thinker trusted by Modi, is the surprise appointment as the new External Affairs Minister. And the powerful National Security Advisor Ajay Doval, elevated recently to cabinet rank, continues to chair the influential Strategic Policy Group and the Defense Planning Committee of the Indian government. In effect, the respective influence of these 3 individuals on key foreign and security policy issues will determine India's decisions under Modi's leadership. At the same time, ongoing global uncertainties, sudden regional disruptions, and geo-economic priorities provide new challenges to the Modi 2.0 government's largely transactional diplomacy and security. India's shift from a policy of non-alignment to one of strategic autonomy with multi-directional engagements has so far advanced its economic and security interests reasonably well. But in today's global environment of great power competition, it has become far more challenging and complex for India to seek to balance relations so as not to gravely affect its trade with the United States, its arms supplies from Russia, and the stability of its border with China. However, with India's enhanced economic and security leverages, can it, in the next 5 years, move from being a balancing power to a leading power in the international system, with the objective of seeking to proactively shape global norms and rules through non-exclusive, issue-based alignments? Will bilateral and trilateral relationships become more significant for India than multilateral ones, or vice versa? If the latter, India's membership and hosting of multilateral fora within the next 5 years provides such opportunities for leadership by India. India will again become a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for the years 2021 and 2022. In 2022, it will chair the G20 and host the G20 summit in India for the first time, at the same time as it celebrates the 75th year of India's independence. In this endeavor, will India also seek to chair the Commonwealth and host the Commonwealth Summit in India in 2024, the year of the next general elections in India? Clearly, there are more questions than answers at this stage. But these key events, I believe, serve as prospective opportunities should Modi exercise the leadership required to make foreign and security policies legacy issues for his second term as Prime Minister. Let me now turn briefly to India's priorities on security policy, especially in relation to Pakistan. There is no immediate interest among the Indian security leadership to resume an official dialogue with Pakistan. Although Pakistan has taken steps to detain some terrorists and seize assets belonging to their affiliates following the Pulwama Balakot security crisis last February, this is not considered adequate by the Indian security leadership. India will therefore, for the moment, continue its stated policy of no talks with terror and seek to continue to pressurize Pakistan, including through an international attempt to blacklist it in the Financial Action Task Force for its failure to curb money laundering and the funding of terror groups. This has been encouraged by the recent listing of Jaish-e-Mohammed leader Masood Azhar as a global terrorist by the UN 1267 Sanctions Committee. At the same time, India could independently seek to deter major Pakistan-based terror attacks through the option of military retaliation, emboldened by the absence of any significant international criticism of its airstrike against Balakot in Pakistan in the aftermath of the Pulwama terror attack. However, if the Pakistani security establishment were to do more in order to ensure sustained and irreversible actions to disrupt terror groups and their affiliates on Pakistani territory from mounting anti-India operations, I believe there could well be enhanced bilateral diplomatic engagement. Firstly, through the reduction in firing across the line of control dividing Kashmir, as well as the resumption of effective cross-border transit and trade links along the line of control. Alongside the establishment of a secure private back channel of communication between the two security establishments and the sharing of information could take place. A substantive decrease in terror attacks over time could provide the environment for the resumption of long-stalled official bilateral peace dialogue between the two countries, which Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan clearly seeks. Although Indian public opinion today, it can be argued, is tougher on Pakistan than ever before, top-level political intervention in India could change this, as was the case during the post-Kargil conflict environment with then Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's peace initiative towards Pakistan, leading to the 2004-2008 bilateral peace process, sustained by the peace dividends on both sides. At the same time, alongside a zero policy against terrorism, the Modi government would need to exercise caution over its stated objective of abrogating Article 370 of the Constitution, which provides a special status to Jammu and Kashmir, as well as the removal of Article 35A of the Constitution, which gives the local legislature the right to decide on Kashmir's permanent residence, lest it lead to demographic changes provoking further violent protests and an increase in the radicalization of Kashmiri youth. Briefly now, let me turn to Afghanistan. Despite the official rhetoric to the contrary, India remains concerned over Afghanistan's US-led peace and reconciliation process with the Afghan Taliban, on the basis that its pace is being forced by the Trump administration's priority of ensuring the withdrawal of US troops after nearly 2 decades, rather than as a genuine effort to bring peace to Afghanistan. India also remains highly suspicious of any arrangement of an interim government in a power-sharing deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan. In contrast, India, clearly ambitiously, seeks a democratic, inclusive, and Afghan-led process for engagement, which should not only be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned, but now Afghan-controlled as well, to lead to the installation of an elected government in Kabul through a democratization process, however flawed the process. In essence, I believe a fundamental security issue for the Modi 2.0 government will be the enforcement on the ground in Afghanistan of international counterterrorism assurances against the presence, training, and the supply of arms and logistics to anti-India terror groups based in Afghanistan. Finally, a few remarks on the UK before I end. For India, the UK is an influential strategic partner and a country with which it is most familiar with. And we shall not mention the World Cup cricket match that takes place in 11 days. And precisely for these reasons, both India and the UK have high expectations of the other. One just has to look at the ambitious bilateral joint statements after Modi's visit to the UK in November 2015, which sought to further transform the strategic partnership. Unfortunately, this has been seriously affected, I believe, by the uncertainties of Brexit the past 3 years, during which India's relations with its strategic partners within and beyond Europe have grown. Nonetheless, post-Brexit opportunities for the bilateral relationship are considerable, especially in terms of a convergence of interests on key issues of growing importance to India, including on cybersecurity, maritime affairs, and defense technology production, alongside, clearly, increased sensitivities and prospective compromises on one another's security concerns. Thank you.
I clearly don't spend enough time on South Asian issues because it wasn't immediately obvious to me what the difference between non-alignment was from strategic autonomy with multidimensional engagement. But I'm not going to ask you to answer that since we are focused on the electoral politics of what's going on in India. I do want to move on to our next outstanding speaker, Antoine Levesques, a research fellow here in the South Asia team, whose expertise is on South Asia and China, regional nuclearization. He's also a Pakistan expert, did his graduate work in international politics at Aberystwyth, and is going to talk to us about India's relations with the US, China, and Russia. Antoine.
Thank you, Kori. Good afternoon. At the risk of overstating their importance over India's wider foreign policy outlook, I will turn to prospects for India's relations with the US and China, with a side consideration for Russia. It is clearly early days, but a key challenge for Indian statecraft to 2024 will remain to simultaneously grow ties with the US and China whilst strengthening India's deterrence and defense towards China. The flip side to India's growing strategic footprint in southern Asia and the Indo-Pacific will become ever more apparent. India will require a deft mix of leadership, process-driven defense, and public diplomacy to manage the growing interdependencies in its separate dealings with Washington and Beijing. India will likely continue giving a US tilt to its balancing act with all major powers, foremost China. Yet India will also need to manage its rising global persona as a geopolitical swing state in wider US-China-led contests. India's choices will have an unprecedented impact on Asian security and likely beyond. So to the US first. US-India strategic interests converge on countering prospects of an Asia dominated by China within the next generation. The 2018 US National Defense Strategy called China a strategic competitor while emphasizing the importance of India. Considering prosperity, trade, and regional connectivity agendas, the China defense factor is by no means the only driver of US-India relations, but its weight is permanently larger in the relationship than in 2014 and could further increase in the next 4+ years. India under Modi is more permanently explicit and comfortable about acknowledging the rivalry with China. Since 2014, the US has become India's topmost all-round international partner, owing to defense and security ties, including in the Indo-Pacific, particularly the Indian Ocean, as a recent IISS regional security assessment report documented at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Yet India will continue to reject the notion that its counter to China is analogous to Washington's. So India will be all the less accepting today of being taken for granted as an onshore balancer as it did a decade ago. At present, US and Indian expectations, luckily, are largely compatible. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo clarified last week, quote, "We get it. We realize it's different to deal with the likes of China and Pakistan from across the ocean than it is when they are your neighbors," unquote. Secretary Pompeo will be Modi 2.0's first extra-regional visiting full minister next week. In this context, a 2+2 dialogue, trilaterals with the US, and to an extent the Quad discussions between senior officials will all develop. US-India bilateral defense and security cooperation has a lot of headroom for growing, given the emphasis of the last few years' worth of political bilateral high-level statements. But an accumulation of challenges on trade, energy, defense procurement, technology, and regional security has the potential to slow down, perhaps halt, but not deplete, the slow accumulation of India-US strategic trust in the last 15 years. Except for defense procurement, India understands none of these challenges are India-specific, unlike the sanctions imposed after India's 1998 nuclear tests. But few in India expect it to escape uncomfortable choices with the US in the next year. Waiting out the current administration is not an option. So on trade, for example. As of yesterday, the US is India's largest trading partner at the exclusion of trade through Hong Kong, and this comes to the detriment of a relationship with China. But on the day Modi returned to office, the US announced the withdrawal of unilateral tariff exemptions worth about $6 billion, or 12% of the value of bilateral trade with India. India rejects the US charge that its markets are too protected and responded last Monday with retaliatory tariffs. Yet hardening access to Chinese markets globally shines a spotlight on market access into India, which is far from being comfortable to India. But India knows, ultimately, that it has nothing to gain from a trade contest with the US. The US has also hinted that its GSP decision could yet be reversed. On sanctions and energy, US legislation relating to Iran and Russia poses a larger strategic challenge. In May, India ended all its supplies of Iranian and Venezuelan oil to comply with US sanctions. This long-expected necessity has not disrupted India's energy security, but it has put the onus on India to compensate for this politically with Iran after Modi's first term already introduced a tilt towards Iran's Gulf rivals. Sanctions and defense. India will leverage its broader defense relationship with the US to minimize the knock-on effect of US efforts to convince its allies and partners to end defense trade with Russia. 60% of India's military inventory remains Russian origin, according to the IISS Military Balance Plus. New Delhi's 2018 decision to buy Russian S-400 advanced air defense system exposes India to US sanctions legislation, casting a potentially longer shadow over the relationship. India may use the situation to bargain for better access to US military technology exports. At the same time, India is not showing any signs of wanting to bind itself closer to the US beyond the benefits it draws already from a bespoke designation as major defense partner. I'll pass on 5G and Afghanistan, which Rahul already discussed. Let me move to China. Despite their acknowledged but understated strategic competition underpinned by growing military deterrence dynamics, India and China under Modi 2.0 look set to explore more areas for cooperation. Think about this. Over the next 4+ years, based on their presumed presence at the G20, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the BRICS summits, as well as one informal summit a year, President Xi and Prime Minister Modi should be meeting upwards of 16 times. Modi and President Xi Jinping reached an understanding at their informal summit in April 2018, following their worst standoff in a generation on their contested border. The understanding reached then is still the framework India and China have at hand to manage their ties. Modi is expected to build on quid pro quos with China, which extend beyond the transactional, yet cannot, owing to the two countries' rivalry, pretend to be strategic. A litmus test for the entire relationship, in my view, will be whether India and China can reach an understanding on India's membership bid to the last, most prestigious of the 4 non-proliferation clubs, the Nuclear Suppliers Group. China no longer expects India to join its Belt and Road Initiative, which India has criticized as insufficiently transparent and inclusive. But India would be willing to cooperate with China on specific projects in third-party countries. Counterterrorism also is an area for cooperation. We saw this at play at the SCO summit last week, and we also saw India supporting China's accession to a presidency of the Financial Action Task Force, an international grouping which will decide by year-end if Pakistan joins North Korea and Iran on a blacklist of states financing terrorism. Bilateral trade, expected to be worth $100 billion by 2019, and investment also, can be expected to provide extra ballast to the relationship, not least to China's satisfaction in the context of growing pressure from the trade conflict with the US. But deterrence and wider defense dynamics, not least on the contested India-China border, will be the key focus of the Modi 2.0 government. India will also focus on the Indian Ocean, where it has a geographical advantage, even if that is narrowing faster to China's relative advantage than India alone expected 5 years ago. India and China could correspondingly seek to institutionalize a security dialogue on that particular sub-region whose security architecture is otherwise changing. Any new changes to Indian higher defense management or implementation of acted reforms on India's cyber and space capabilities will also have a China driver. Finally, as Modi turns to foreign policy for a potential legacy, absence of a military-led face-off on the border or in the Indian Ocean could create conditions, in my mind, for both countries to advance towards resolution of their decades-old border dispute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antoine. Our big, strong finish is from Viraj Solanki, a research analyst here in the South Asia program. He's an expert on electoral politics in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Myanmar, and the Maldives, and on Indian foreign policy with the littoral and island states of South Asia and the Indian Ocean. He's also done a lot of interesting work on counterterrorism and was educated across the street in war studies at King's College. He is going to talk to us about Indian foreign and security policy with the littoral countries, if he can manage to get through it without his cold and cough overtaking him. Go.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Kori, and thanks for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Sorry. The Modi government 2.0's foreign and security priorities towards its regional neighbours will focus primarily on the littoral and island states of the Indian Ocean. Emphasising the foreign policy priorities of the new government, Modi's swearing-in ceremony following his re-election saw participation from the leaders of the 7-member Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, or more easily known as BIMSTEC, which includes Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, as well as the Mauritian Prime Minister. Subsequently, Modi's first foreign visit following his re-election was to the Maldives and Sri Lanka. Modi's visit to the Maldives was the first bilateral visit by an Indian Prime Minister since 2011, whilst Modi's visit to Sri Lanka was his third bilateral visit since 2015, but prior to which there had been no Indian Prime Ministerial bilateral visit to neighbouring Colombo in 28 years since 1987. The Modi government's second term will look to enhance its Indian Ocean strategy, announced by Modi in 2015 as Security and Growth for All in the Region, or also known as SAGA, which is a multifaceted effort to engage politically, diplomatically, economically, and on security matters with the Indian Ocean island states. This comes at a time of significant increase in major power interest in the Indian Ocean region. China, India, Japan, and the US all have competing interests and projects in the littoral and island states in the Indian Ocean, whose strategic significance arises primarily from their proximity to key international sea lanes. This means that there are now more potential points of contention between the major powers operating in the region. Therefore, the Modi government will likely focus on enhancing 3 key areas of cooperation with its neighbours. Firstly, connectivity, and including project execution. Second, maritime security. And third, counterterrorism. Firstly, strengthening regional connectivity in the Eastern Indian Ocean will be a major priority for the Modi government in a region that is one of the world's least integrated. This will require a focus on expanding the Indian government's capacity to ensure project execution and the completion of pending connectivity projects. Due to India's resource advantage, India will look to incentivize cooperation with its neighbors, including with BIMSTEC member states, without insisting on this being reciprocal. Significantly, to expand India's own capacity to develop regional infrastructure, the Modi government has partnered with Japan on 2 trilateral projects in Sri Lanka in 2019, including for the development of the US $500 million East Container Terminal at Colombo Port. And with the new Modi government looking to expand this trilateral cooperation into other neighbouring countries, this provides an opportunity and or potential for collaboration with the US, France, and the UK in the Indian Ocean. The next 5 years are crucial, and I want to stress this being crucial for India's project execution in the Indian Ocean region. Unless India's project execution improves and a viable alternative of infrastructure is provided by India, China's presence within the island nations will increase due to its successful delivery of infrastructure projects. Under the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has substantially increased its involvement in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, the Maldives, and the Seychelles, with Mauritius also set to join the initiative. Secondly, the Modi government will look to enhance maritime security cooperation in the Indian Ocean, building upon its vision of Saga. During Modi's visit to the Maldives, he inaugurated an Indian-supplied coastal radar surveillance system and also committed to strengthen maritime security through coordinated patrolling and capacity building. India's maritime activities also include investing in 3 ports in Sri Lanka and developing the airstrip and jetty on Agalega Island in Mauritius and on the Seychelles Assumption Island to enhance maritime surveillance. Therefore, there is also scope for India to cooperate with extra-regional powers to bolster regional maritime security in the Indian Ocean. Thirdly, strengthening counter-terrorism cooperation will be a priority for the Modi government. The deadly attacks in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday emphasized the vulnerability of all South Asian nations to ISIS-inspired violence. A focus on counter-terrorism in a reconstituted India-Sri Lanka-Maldives trilateral meeting at the level of the country's national security advisors, which was discussed during Modi's visit to Sri Lanka, as well as in the NSA-level BIMSTEC meeting, could be 2 ways to enhance regional counter-terrorism cooperation. During Modi's visit to the Maldives, he called for the establishment of a global conference on terrorism, and the 2 sides also established a joint working group on counter-terrorism and de-radicalization to help address concerns over radicalization. Enhancing cooperation in these 3 areas is important for India, as due to the lack of extensive connectivity links, India's influence within each of its neighbors does not depend on India's own capacity, but on having governments in power in the respective countries in the region that are favorable to India. For example, India had a more difficult relationship with the previous governments in the Maldives and Sri Lanka, who were closer to China. The Modi government now has a coinciding tenure with the Maldivian and Bangladeshi leaders until 2023 as a window of opportunity to strengthen cooperation with these more favorable regional governments, and also with the next Sri Lankan leader until 2024 after the country's presidential elections in December of this year. In conclusion, strengthening cooperation with its neighbors on connectivity, maritime security, and counterterrorism will be a major factor in determining India's ability to play a substantive role in the neighborhood in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Viraj. So much that's interesting to me in these 3 presentations. So many questions I would like to ask my team. But I'm going to give you the first shot at it. Before I ask them, how might overtaking the British economy as a major economic force change India's relationship with the United Kingdom? Or are Indian markets too protected? Or how effective can this emergent Indian strategy be of partnering with Japan? Are there natural limits to that? Oh, lots of things. And what would it take to see an Asia dominated by a rising India rather than an Asia dominated by a rising China? I would love to know all of those things, but I'm going to give the fabulous folks who showed up today first shot at questions and answers. Yes, sir, in the front row. Hold on just a second. A microphone's coming to you. Please give us your name and your organization.
Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. I think it's very concerning. I mean, during the election, Modi was quite hawkish towards Pakistan, and there is an opportunity now, I think, with his new government to reach out to Pakistan. I think it was unfortunate that Modi didn't invite Imran Khan to the inauguration, and that would have been a good opportunity. At the end of the day, India has to open lines of communication with Pakistan in terms of intelligence and security. If that is not done, the terrorism is going to continue.
Question?
The question is, can Modi make this change to reach out to Pakistan instead of just being so hawkish?
It's an interesting question. Rahul, I'd like you to take the first shot at that.
Sure, thank you, Kori. I mean, as I said in my remarks, I think at the moment, I believe there is no interest in the Indian security leadership to reach out to Pakistan. I mean, we've seen recently and currently the tensions between the two countries being quite high. In February this year, a few months ago, the India-Pakistan security crisis was the worst in nearly 2 decades. So I think, currently I don't see any a move in this direction. What I also said in my talk is that actually this could change. And if this does change, then it is Modi's expanded electoral mandate, his decisive leadership, the fact that it is a center-right government in power in India that could deliver and could impact on this change. But for the change to take place, I think it's fairly clear that the Indian security establishment is saying to Pakistan that yes, the diplomatic engagement will continue as it is continuing, but for India to do more, Pakistan has to do more first. And its ability to disrupt any potential prospective terror attack mounted by Pakistan-based terror groups is fundamental in this. The ability also to ensure that the terror organizations, there is no reverse in this position, that it is sustained, the pressure by Pakistan on these groups, again is key. So what I'm arguing is really a 3-step sort of process. First step, that the Indian side could be willing to engage diplomatically as long as there are some initiatives on the Pakistani side. The initiatives on the Pakistani side could focus on the line of control alongside the establishment of a back channel between the security leaderships of the two countries, which could, in the absence of any major terror attack, lead to the re-establishment of the official bilateral peace process. So I think there is an opportunity, but we don't see the opportunity at the moment.
Anybody else want to add?
Thank you, Kori. Can I just add that one of the stakes of obviously any dialogue is to ensure that both countries are very clear about their own sense of what strategic stability looks like for the two countries. I won't develop beyond that, but that's obviously very important.
Viraj?
Just to add, one interesting point in the next few years is that due to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's rotating presidency, either India or Pakistan will become president of the SCO before 2024. And this means that within the next 4 to 5 years, either India or Pakistan will host the SCO summit, meaning that either Imran Khan or Narendra Modi will have to go to one of the to the neighboring country to participate in the summit. So there may be something that develops out of that in the future.
Very good. Question all the way in the back corner.
Hi, good afternoon. Walter Ladwick from King's College. Had a quick question for Rahul or the rest of the panel. In your comments, you referenced the idea of cross-border strikes as being a future response to terrorism. So that sort of suggests that Modi and his team have learned a lesson that the February attack at Balakot kind of worked out for them. Is that the lesson 4 months on that you think that they've come to?
Great question.
I think the lesson is that India, for the first time, was able to carry out an attack on Pakistani territory, which was really, when I was serving in the Indian government so many years ago, I mean, this was a red line that India would not have crossed. I mean, it was very clear it would not have crossed it. The fact that India and the Modi government, with the National Security Advisor leading on this, crossed the line, I think in a way it provides a greater set of options. So hypothetically, just suppose there is another major terror attack on Indian soil which emanates, as the Indian security leadership could determine, from Pakistan. I cannot see the National Security Advisor not providing in his menu of options another strike against Pakistani territory. I mean, I just see, I mean, that's unforeseeable in my sense. And once that option is there in an official list of maybe 3 or 4 options, then the decision to do this or not rests with the Prime Minister.
Other questions? Yes, sir, on the aisle.
Hello, Tim Wilsey from King's College London. Thanks to all 3 of you, really good presentation. Rahul, there was a curious statement during Pulwama in which it was suggested that part of the attack was actually preemptive. Could you just comment on whether preemption then will become part of India's strategy in dealing with the terror threat from Pakistan?
Thanks, Tim. I think in the initial narrative that we saw coming out from Delhi, the term preemptive was used. And the sense, I think, was that there was some intelligence that there could be a strike on Indian territory in that sense. But I think as we sort of, as the narrative sort of shifted and changed as we went along, I think the preemptive aspect became much weaker. So I am not entirely convinced that the preemptive aspect of the Balakot strike was what was key. And I think as the Indian government then subsequently and the American National Security Advisor also, I think, stated that India's sort of retaliatory aspect, military retaliation, becomes more important rather than the preemptive. So I think, yes, you're absolutely right. It was in the early parts of the narrative. But as you and I are aware, the narrative has shifted over time.
I'd like to ask Antoine, for the Pakistani perspective on this, did preemption become less part of the story in the Pakistani narrative about the strikes?
Thank you, Kori. There are Pakistani colleagues in the room who can speak to that, but my take would be that Pakistan, like China, like India, is still learning the lessons of what happened based on its assessment of facts and whatever it's still learning about what happened. The irony of that, of course, being that it's important to know those lessons for the next crisis, but the next crisis can't be presumed to be the textbook copy of the previous one. So that's one aspect. In this respect, there have been commentaries in Pakistan criticizing this sort of perspective around preemption for quite obvious reasons. But I would want to still see some evidence that this has now percolated officially through the military system. I'm not saying that it hasn't, but I don't have the evidence that it has. Pakistan moving forward emphasized in February strongly its sense of proportionate response and responsibility. More generally, we could expect more of that to happen. So in that sense, I don't think preemption or a narrative around preemption would be in any way something Pakistan could contemplate for itself.
Next question, up here on the right.
I'm David Loyne. I'm from King's, among other hats. Can I just drill down a bit further into the Indo-Pak relations? It sounds rather a gloomy prognosis that India's not interested in doing very much at the moment in trying to improve things. And it sounds from Rahul's description as if India's leaving the US, the UN, US FATF, UN blacklisting as a way of sort of squeezing Pakistan rather than getting more proactively engaged. Now, given, just connecting this to Afghanistan, given how much work America is doing in terms of the heavy lifting in trying to bring an Afghan deal to the table with the obvious end point of November next year and the US election and the end of, as it were, Trump's patience with American engagement in Afghanistan, I wonder if India would, in its own best interests, be better served being a bit more proactive in terms of engaging with Pakistan proactively towards improving relations across Indo-Pak and Afghanistan.
Interesting.
Thank you, David. I think if you were situated in the Prime Minister's office in India, you look at the sort of priorities for India's foreign and security policy in the next 5 years. I mean, for India, the priority is not Pakistan. I mean, the priority, as I've said, are much global prospects in terms of foreign policy. How do you maintain the relationship with the US, counter China, engage with Europe? So I agree with you that Pakistan does form a key element in the list of priorities, but at the moment there is really no appetite or enthusiasm for the relationship, partly because when Prime Minister Modi was elected, as you know, for the first time in 2014, there was initial enthusiasm. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif of Pakistan was invited for the swearing in, and the Indian narrative on that is that, well, it was all rebuffed by the attack in Pathankot in January 2016. So there's no incentive politically, there's no incentive in strategic terms to begin now a sort of an engagement with Pakistan. My argument is that if we take this, and I think this is largely a given, if we take this as a given, how best to engage with Pakistan, and it is through private back channel communication, related communication, to start building the elements of trust between the two countries. And then possibly, let me just strike out here and say that, in 2022, India will host for the first time the G20 summit. I think in the Indian diplomatic calendar, this will be the most important event for Modi in the next 5 years, coinciding with the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Perhaps, at that time or soon before, there could be an outreach purely based on Indian interests, depending on the situation on the ground. So what I'm saying is that there is an interest in India in engaging with Pakistan, but not on the terms that were said before.
In the far back.
Thank you to all of you. Aditya Dave from RUSI. So Rahul, you mentioned in your comments about the lack of international criticism following the Balakot strikes. I was just wondering whether you thought that the calculation in Delhi is that this is likely to continue if there are similar attacks in the future and if India responds with other similar strikes in the future. So yeah, I'd like to.
Sure. To me, what was striking was engaging with people I've known in the who've retired from the Indian security establishment, and comparing what happened with the Balakot strikes, in the last few crises between India and Pakistan. And the one factor that everyone mentioned was the international support that was provided to India. International support in two ways. One, in terms of the post-Pulwama attack, the sense of India being a victim of terrorism, etc. But more important, in the past there was always a sense of restraint. There would be from countries that were concerned with the India-Pakistan situation a sense to India and the Indian leadership: listen, this has happened, but let's have restraint. Don't carry out an attack. Be restrained. We saw that after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, etc. This time, it appears from their narrative that this element of restraint was not there. And very few of them pointed to the US National Security Advisor statement soon after, which essentially to the Indian leadership provided an opportunity to mount a retaliatory strike. So this was significant, this change in international perceptions. And the reason for this change, clearly, obviously, is that India is seeking, and other countries are seeking to engage with India economically. And perhaps that is what made the difference.
In the center.
Thank you, Rahul. Adil Sultan from King's College, and probably Rahul already knows what I'm going to ask, and you have the response. I'm not giving a Pakistani perspective, but just a different perception. Prime Minister Modi promised economic reforms in the previous elections, but there's a perception he failed. In this election, Prime Minister Modi used Pakistan card and the militant nationalism to win these elections. He has won the elections, and we have yet to see how next tenure ends up. But Rahul, on your assertion that this was for the first time that India acted against Pakistan's territory, and probably it was the first time also India also realized the limits of its military power because it was humiliated by an adversary which is conventionally relatively smaller in size. The question is, if Prime Minister Modi doesn't want to engage politically, and he has tried a military option and has been humiliated, so do we see the continuation of the same rhetoric for the next entire tenure, or is there a possible way out?
Interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rahul.
Adil, as I said, I think at the moment, and I say this very carefully, I choose my words carefully. At the moment, I believe there is no interest in the Indian security community to engage with Pakistan. But, there is clearly the possibility of that engagement, which I think from the Indian side now, it appears to be on the basis that, well, what more can Pakistan do to counter or disrupt terror groups on its soil, more than what is being done now? I mean, could there be irreversible, could there be sustained action on this? Now, if that were to, or even if the early stages of that were to come about, then, as I said, I think that there will be an interest in engaging with Pakistan. I would think privately, through back channels, other forms of communication, to see whether there could be elements, there could be goodwill gestures across the line of control, decrease in the firing by both sides in the LOC, leading to an overt official peace process. So by no means am I actually saying that there will be no engagement between India and Pakistan in the next 5 years. I'm arguing that at the moment it's unlikely, but over a passage of time, maybe by 2022 or before, there could well be. And I think, for every Indian Prime Minister, the legacy, if there's one legacy issue, it is to have a peaceful relationship with Pakistan. And Prime Minister Modi, I believe, is no exception to this.
So we have very short time remaining and a sea of hands out there, which delights me because it tells me how engaged all of you are in this conversation and how demanding you are going to be of our panelists, which is the way I love the IISS conversations to be. I am, however, only going to take one last question, and it's from the gal with her hand up right there on the right-hand side. And then I'm going to ask my closing question. She's right there. I'm going to ask my closing question, and then I am going to request that our panelists remain around so that we can end the formal program on time, and yet all of you can ask your questions of them individually. Okay, last question here.
Great, thank you. Saskia Wolverman from the Foreign Office. Thanks for all of the presentations. I think each of them emphasised the kind of importance under the first Modi government of kind of outward prime ministerial visits as a way of advancing foreign policy priorities. So do you see in the second Modi term a sort of similar sort of activism from the Prime Minister on the world stage? Or, given that we seem to have kind of the Prime Minister's sort of preferred foreign policy leads in place and empowered now, do you think there might be a greater role for instance, the External Affairs Minister?
Fantastic question. I'm going to pile mine on and go down the row for each of you to answer. My question is, I would be interested in each of you identifying the one area you think likeliest for major policy change in a second Modi term from the policy of the first Modi term. Okay, let's go in reverse order. Viraj.
Okay. To answer Kori's question first, in terms of the Indian Ocean, I think the likeliest major policy change will be actually project execution of connectivity projects. In his first public speech, the new Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, stressed this and stressed that there's a tremendous scope for improvement of project execution, and that one significant change, this seems very bureaucratic, but it will have big geostrategic impacts if it doesn't happen, is that the new Indian Foreign Ministry, the Indian Foreign Ministry under Dr. Jaishankar have now set up a project monitoring scheme, just as the wider government of India is doing. So this is key, I think, because if India ensures project execution and project completion, it will then be able to provide viable alternatives to the Indian Ocean island states as an alternative to China's infrastructure projects in the region. because, for example, in Nepal, India and Nepal signed a deal for a Panchaswaram multi-purpose energy power project in 1996. It's still not taken place. So there's so much that can still be done. And I see a new optimism and activism under the new Indian Foreign Minister to make sure that the connectivity projects are a priority and that this is really improved in the next 5 years. And then to Saskia's question, I think we will see a similar activism of Modi in the world stage. He's been to the Maldives, Sri Lanka, and then Kyrgyzstan for the SCO, then he's going to Japan for the G20. So I think this will continue to be a role. But on the foreign minister is not traveling as yet with the Prime Minister on his trips abroad. It's the Foreign Secretary and the National Security Advisor. So I think the Foreign Minister, there will be a greater role in his activism abroad as well. But I see that taking place as parallel to the prime ministerial visit. So, for example, Modi went to the Maldives and Sri Lanka as his first visit. Jaishankar went to Bhutan and then went to Tajikistan last week for another summit. So there are separate tracks, but I see overall as a connected structure, continued activism on the world stage between the prime minister and the foreign minister.
Excellent, Viraj. Antoine.
Thank you, Kori. To answer your question, I'll second what Viraj said from the perspective of someone who came to this discussion looking at China. The Indian perspective on this will remain to have a sort of asymmetrical response to the Belt and Road Initiative with a mixture of explicit and implicit matching responses to the BRI. There's also an angle in India's BRI response which relates to using this as a support and a motive for greater relations with other Asian powers and middle powers. So I think I'd look at that space. On the question about the leadership on foreign policy, I would agree that the Prime Minister himself is, on balance, likely to keep a very firm hand on the interactions. We saw an unprecedented degree of personalization on the part of Modi for India's foreign policy in the first term. Some of these interactions, not least with China, will continue. And I don't see how externalizing this to someone could really be of a nature to reinforce strategic trust with China, particularly. With Russia, a similar case could be made with President Putin. Face is very important, and I think it's a big driver in the way the sort of Wuhan agreement with understanding with China was reached.
Excellent. Rahul.
Thank you. I was in Delhi on the day of the swearing in of Prime Minister Modi on the 30th of May. And I can't tell you not the surprise, but the shock of the appointment of Jaishankar as the External Affairs Minister was tremendous. And my sense is that actually Jaishankar and the Prime Minister's appointment of Jaishankar, unprecedented, he will actually lead on the broad foreign policy issues, the big picture relationships that we've talked about. But equally important, the Home Minister, Amit Shah, the new Home Minister, the National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, now with cabinet rank, will focus a lot more, I think, on regional security issues. So possibly, I think the key will be to see how these three key individuals are able to influence decision-making on these issues. But if there is a divergence of sorts, then I think that may be useful. The Prime Minister, I think, may travel less. I think he's more keen to bring events into India. The G20 is a classic example, maybe the Commonwealth Summit in 2024 and other major events. So I think there could be a shift tactically to have big picture events in India in different parts of India, not just Delhi. Remember, 2024 is election year in India. I mean, for politicians, it's not that far away. So I think it'll be key. On Kori's point, one sentence, I think to me, the Indian Ocean space is the space to look at. This is where I believe there will be a change between the Modi 1.0 and Modi 2.0 governments. And this is a space that we at the IISS are hoping to fill by my Adelphi book, which is long delayed, on India's
so eager to read
on India's new maritime security strategy. so I think I'd be looking very closely at the Indian Ocean space to see where other countries, the UK, the US, France, can actually work together with India on delivering its objectives.
That is an excellent note to close on, and I'm going to take a page out of Rahul's book and talk about upcoming activities. So he talked about his upcoming Adelphi book on the Indian Ocean. I'm going to mention 4 events we have coming up next week. The first, on Tuesday, the 25th of June, from 9:30 to 10:30, is the launch of Sarah Rain's Adelphi book on Europe's strategic future. I just finished reading it. It's gangbusters. Also on Tuesday, this time from 3 to 4 p.m., a talk from Virginia Kamali, the head of our CSDP program, and Flora Berger, the Assistant Research Analyst for Sub-Saharan Africa, on Mali, looking at when localized conflict becomes a regional challenge. On Wednesday, the 26th, from 12 to 1, Frank Hoffman from the National Defense University in the United States, talking about the changing character of warfare. And Ben Barry, who is here, is going to be chairing that. And lastly, on Friday the 28th, from 3:30 to 4:30, Dr. Marco Joel from the Africa Research Group and Andrew Chi from our own Ball Club, talking about peacekeeping in Africa. My friends, won't you join me in thanking these 3 sharpshooters on South Asia issues for teaching us how to understand the effects of Modi's re-election?